There we go. So welcome everybody to the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council speaker series. My name is Zach. I'm the council coordinator. And for those of you who are not entirely familiar with the Watershed Council, our mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance the Nehalem watershed through leadership, cooperation, and education. Where we do it is in the Lower Nehalem, which is defined as the area downstream of the confluence between the Nehalem River and Humbug Creek. And that's up around this area here, pretty close to Highway 26. But it includes all of the Salmonberry River, as well as all of the North Fork River as well. Now this slide, what we do and how we do that mission is we work with the various stakeholders throughout the watershed to voluntarily restore and enhance habitat for fish and wildlife. This is done through research projects, fish passage projects, riparian plantings, in-stream enhancements, and wetland restoration, as well as educational events like our speaker series right now, our Explore Nature hikes, which we'll be announcing some more of later, and other instances like the biennial Nehalem Estuary cleanup. Hey, we did it this year. To those of you who were there for it, thank you very much. It was a great success. It happened on Saturday, March 5th of this year. We had a lot of great project partners. This is just a fragment of them for it. And I pulled this from the Solve website, but it's pretty much the why do a cleanup? And it's that this material in the system is detrimental to water quality, detrimental to wildlife, could be harmful to human health. And it's a great way to bring the community together in an event that we can all feel good about doing something positive together. And so you can see on the map, a map of the Nehalem Bay and all the areas that we had crews walking through and picking stuff up. And this year we pulled out 20 yards of trash weighing over 2,500 pounds. We recycled 125 pounds of scrap metal. 5 yards of styrofoam were removed, as well as a variety of other recyclables. Some of the highlights are a small plastic yard deer, a pink flamingo, a message in a bottle that said, "Send more pie." A hot water heater was pulled out, and just a whole slew of other stuff, including, a 50-gallon drum that still had hazelnut flavoring in it for like coffee and stuff. Here is our big list of volunteers, our big list of partners and sponsors. Again, thank you to all the volunteers who came out. We had over 100 this year. Give you a second to really take in how many pieces of the community here all showed up to help. This event's always a partnership between the Watershed Council and the Community Trust. So thank you again to the Community Trust for all the work they do in putting this event together. And that is the end of me talking to y'all tonight. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jon, who has a storied history with both watershed councils and at OSU that I couldn't possibly summarize in a few minutes. But Jon, by all means, take it away.
Thanks, Zach. I think I can share my screen here with it. So I'm Jon Souder, Forest Watershed Extension Specialist at OSU. I have a joint appointment in the Forest Engineering Resources and Management Department. And the bulk of my time, though, is spent in Forestry and Natural Resources Extension. And part of my, the joy of that extension piece of my position is getting to work with watershed councils. Zach said I had a storied, rich and storied career. I was the executive director of the Coos Watershed Association for 15 years from 2000 to 2015 until OSU made me an offer I couldn't refuse to. I couldn't refuse at that point in my career, and now I'm looking at the end of that, and I will be retiring on June 30th and be back in Coos Bay for it. So what I want to talk about tonight is a study that I was involved with as a principal investigator from 2018, and then essentially into and through the pandemic with it, and that we just finished up at the end of 2021 for it. And what the study involved is that we were asked by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, an organization of a little controversy of late, which I would be happy to talk about later if people are interested in it, came to the College of Forestry and said that they would like to essentially redo a study that they had done in 2000 on the effects of active forest management on drinking water quality. And the dean of the college rounded up a bunch of us and asked us if we would be interested in doing it. And because of my kind of position as a forest watershed extension specialist, and I had just finished running the Watershed Research Cooperative, it seemed logical that I would take that project on. And so, you know, again, kind of given the political situation that we're in these days with it, I thought that the best avenue to kind of manage the project would be through the Institute of Natural Resources at OSU. And they provided us an administrative home. Lisa Gaines, their director, is also a very good facilitator and worked with us to put together a very talented steering committee of 10 folks for it. So what we did was that we synthesized, you know, our task essentially was to synthesize the effects of active forest management. And this is harvesting roads, forest roads, as well as revegetation on drinking water quality. And so we were looking at drinking water quality. For those, there are 156 community water supplies in Oregon that rely on surface water as their primary source. You know, and you've got a bunch of them up on the North Coast in your area. We'll talk a little bit about sizes for it, but they range everywhere from Arch Cape and Oceanside all the way up to the city of Portland with it. So you've got quite a bit of variety in that. So we got the steering committee together, and one of their tasks was to tell us what they thought we should be focusing on for our review for it. And they gave us a prioritized list with it, and it was interesting priorities. And these are the ones in their priority order that they gave us for it. And we thought that we could carve off 4 of them. We were being a bit idealistic, I think, with it. But those 4 topics were changes in the water quantity and the timing of water flows in relationship, again, to forest management activities, effects of sediment and turbidity, which is fairly well recognized, forest chemicals. I was a little bit surprised that forest chemicals turned out as the 3rd priority and not the top priority for it, but nonetheless. And then the 4th item is something that I was not really that familiar with when we started this project, and that is the relationship between natural organic matter or carbon, dissolved carbon in the water, and the production of what are called disinfection byproducts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes for it. You know, so again, those are the 4 areas that we focused on with it. We also did a survey of the 156 community water supplies, and we had some other modeling that was done for us in forest cover changes and fire risk for it. So what we came out with, and this is the course of essentially 3 years worth of work on this, is that we have a website that you can go and you can look at the process that we use, the materials that we developed, a fairly rich source of information. OFRI did a report called Keeping Drinking Water Safe, which is kind of more their public out-facing document on it. So they took parts of our report and combined it with some of the other work that they do in terms of interviews and highlights of people involved in managing forests. The report itself, which is 300 pages, was published as a book in September by the Oregon State University Extension Communications. That's downloadable for it. If you really want and you make a good case, I've got some paper copies. Zach's going to get a paper copy of it, so you can hit him up for it. And then in March of 2021, we had a virtual conference where the authors presented the work that they did. We had panels of regulators, forest managers, water utility folks, nonprofits in there. And recording of all of those sessions is also available through the OregonForest.org website for it. So this is kind of the sum total of the products that we did as a result of the project. Okay, so some general caveats when we start looking at things in relationship. I mentioned that size is size is important. Here we have the oceanside, the contributing area for the oceanside community water supply is basically 2 square miles on the coast. And while they do have some linkages to Arch Cape, the Arch Cape contributing area is not much larger than that for it. In contrast, you have someplace like Sweet Home that's taking its water from the South Santiam River, and it's got a contributing area or watershed that's almost 560 acres or 560 square miles, and that's coming off of the high Cascades. It's going through a lot of Forest Service, BLM, industry, timberland before it gets down to their intake for it. So it's important not only the size of the watershed, but also the geography. Those watersheds, those of us who are on the coast, our water is basically coming from rainfall for it. Those community water supplies, that are on the west side of the Cascade Range, their water is primarily being produced as snow melt in there. And so there's a lot of differences in timing and flows and the kind of persistence of flows depending on where you are in the state. There's also 3 or 4 community water supplies over in Eastern Oregon, such as Baker City, that also rely on surface water. And that's a very different environment over there for it, and much drier, which is one of the reasons that most of the cities on the dry side or the east side of the Cascades are using well water, groundwater, rather than surface water. So geography is important, geology is important in this, particularly as we get to talking about sediment and turbidity, but also even things about how the water percolates through a contributing area that comes out upstream from the intake for the water supply. So it's very different if you're in a sandstone area, and we are down here further south on the coast, and you have some areas of Tyee sandstone and other formations like that in the north coast. And the water percolates through those areas much more slowly, typically, than it does in a basalt geology, particularly if the basalt is fractured as it cooled. Now, if the basalt hasn't fractured, then it's even more dense than sandstone. But in most cases, the basalt is typically more fractured than the sandstone is. Land ownership, land management also matters. We've seen that particularly in the reductions in forest management activities that occurred on federal lands as a result of the Northwest forest plan for it. Where you've got industrial timberland in your watershed, you know, especially on the coast now, you're looking at fairly short-term rotations. So maybe, you know, 35 to 55 years is a typical rotation on the coast now, it seems like, with it, you know, and so things are turning over much more rapidly, and we'll see what some of the effects of that are for it. And it also depends on where you are in relationship between the water intake, the raw water intake, and the forest for it. You know, and so in a lot of cases, and again, in this example of Oceanside with Short Creek, it's all forest upstream of the raw water intake, with the exception maybe of a quarry or so up there. If you're looking at someplace like Sweet Home and South Santiam, you can see a real mosaic of land uses in there. Another good example of that is Eugene, where Eugene is taking water from the McKenzie River, and it's coming off of the Cascades and coming down through the McKenzie River. But before it gets to their intake, which is actually in downtown Springfield, it's going through a lot of agricultural lands, and it's going through a lot of rural residential lands. And those impacts are different and typically more intense than the impacts that you see from forestry for it. You know, so the intervening land use is important. And then finally, it's challenging, we found, at least in our literature synthesis, is it's really challenging to extrapolate from studies that have been done, and typically the studies that are published and that we were looking at are done in upper watershed areas, smaller watershed areas, where you've got a lot more control over what's going on with it. Then again, you have, in the case of someplace like Sweet Home, that's got this huge watershed that's coming off the South Santiam River. So it's very difficult to, and somewhat hazardous to extrapolate from something that's taking place in a 2 square mile watershed and extrapolate that up to something that's a much larger watershed. So those are the general kind of caveats that we identified as we were putting this review together for it. Okay, so what did we find with it? So when we looked at water yield, there actually has been a fair amount of work that's been done on the relationship between forest management, particularly harvesting and water yield. Fairly standard forest hydrology 101 with it. Although again, the effects are highly variable depending on where you are and what the geology is. But fairly common and fairly standard short-term effects from timber harvest are you have less evapotranspiration because you've basically cut the trees with it. You have decreased interception by the needles and leaves. Most cases they're needles because we're in conifers here. And those are catching a lot of water, and they're also catching a lot of snow. And in many cases, that water and that snow evaporates before it ever hits the ground. And so it doesn't essentially go into the contributing, it doesn't go into the streams, and those streams don't then go down and end up in a raw water intake for it. And again, you know, most of the work has been done on these small watersheds. And most of the watersheds that we were looking at were bigger by orders of magnitude commonly than what the studies were done on. But there are a couple of interesting studies. One long-term study that I was also involved with through the Watershed Research Cooperative was looking at the Alci watershed study. And this is a classic, almost kind of the classic watershed study, certainly in Oregon, that ran initially from 1959 to 1973, was conducted with logging practices typical of that time, which would never be done today with it. And the interesting part then was that we were able to go back starting in 2005. So that original study went through 1959 to 1973. And actually one of the results of that was the initial Forest Practices Act because of what effects were shown in that study. We came back though in 2005 because the landowners, Plum Creek at that time, in one of the basins that had been studied, were going back to start harvesting because it had come up in their rotation cycle for it. So basically went back and restarted the study that had been done in the 1960s and looked at the difference between the 1960s era logging practices and effects and compared that to the practices from more contemporary forest regulations for it. And one of the really interesting things that came through was looking at this question of timing of water flows for it. And so this is a classic, what's called a BASI design, before after control impact for it. So we had some control or reference basins in Flynn Creek, which had never been significantly harvested and still hasn't been significantly harvested. It's a Forest Service research natural area now. And Needle Branch, which was managed under a kind of standard industrial timberland management for it. And so the initial studies, if we looked at the kind of seasonality of water flow in this chart here, which goes in the water year from October to October, or October 1st to September 30th for it. This is some work that my colleague Catalina Segura and a group in forest engineering did that evaluated the stream flow records, both from the original study, which we were lucky to have, as well as from this more contemporary study. And so what happened in the original study is you cut, and then typically, you get these increased flows in the cut area in comparison to the reference area. So this is the kind of zero line. So if everything was similar between the cut area and the reference area, it would be on the zero line there. If it's above the zero line, then you have more, in this case, water coming from the harvested area than you compared to the reference area. And if it's below that zero line, you have less. So what we can see in the immediate after effect of the first harvest back in the late 60s, and this is fairly consistent in other studies in the literature, is when you short term after you harvest, you get more water, particularly in the summer, but you get more water overall, again, because it's not evapotranspiring, it's not getting intercepted by the needles and evaporating for it. And then basically because you don't have any shade or cover, you get a small deficit in the late summer as things dry out. But actually in the early summer, some what are called summer base flows, you may have increased early summer water as a result of harvest. Okay, so that's what happens in the initial harvest. Now, if we kind of fast forward, about 40 years or so, and look at what the flows look like in these same streams, exactly same gauging stations, in fact, some of the same equipment even, with a about 40-year-old plantation in there, is that you see that you don't get these increased stream flows in the late fall, in the really dry period in the late fall. In fact, you get less water with it. And then what you get in the summer base flow is in fact quite a bit less water, on the order of 50% or so less water as a result of these rapidly growing plantations. I mean, they're sucking up water, putting on diameter and height on the trees, and as a result of that, they're evapotranspiring and intercepting a lot of water for it with it. And so that was the effect of the first set of harvest with it. Then when we went in and did the harvest after the second entry, and the second entry was done in 2010 or 2014 or so, we saw some of the same patterns that we saw in the first initial entry, short-term, increases in inflows with it, still some deficits in the summer, but not the same magnitude that we saw with the older plantation, and not as much kind of recovery as we saw in the initial study. And then we looked at it again, as it, and this effect of the increased flow tends to be about 5 to 7 years, after the harvest. Well, within the first 5 to 7 years after the harvest, and the rapidly growing plantations, that's where you're seeing it really suck the water up. And that's what we saw again in this second set of after the harvest for it. And that begins that, fairly consistently, particularly in the summer, base flows looks a lot like what it did, after an older plantation for it. There's also an effect, we don't have anybody who's lived on the coast, particularly for any while, knows that we have wet years and we have dry years for it. And we're actually just hopefully coming out of a series of dry years. And so the effects of this are even more pronounced where you've got dry summers for it. And that's something that we are actually anticipating having more of with climate change on the coast. So that's kind of the water quantity and water timing story that came out of this that I think is very relevant to coastal forestry issues. So if we go to our next kind of a topic of interest with this, turbidity is a big issue for water treatment plants. If they get too much turbidity, they can't adequately treat the water for it. And typically what happens in a lot of cases is they just close down the intake, and hopefully they have sufficient water stored in reservoirs or in tanks to last throughout that period of high turbidity. There's also ways to filter it out. A lot of those are fairly equipment and energy and chemical intensive. So the more turbidity you have, the harder it is to treat the water. And turbidity and sediment really has been a longstanding issue in forest management with it, and was some of the reasons for the initial Forest Practice Act that came in 1971. So what we found, and again, kind of, we were just synthesizing literature with it, and predominantly the literature that was published since 2000, since that was reflective of more contemporary practices, is that basically a lot of the sediment turbidity is fairly strongly correlated with how much of an area is harvested. And also particularly on how much road work is done, and particularly new roads, but we also have a lot of legacy roads on the coast. A lot of roads were put in after the Columbus Day blowdown in 1962 or 64. A lot of roads were pushed in to capture that blowdown, and a lot of those roads were very poorly constructed, and we're still seeing road failures from those roads with it. And so if you look at this chart, Marianne Ryder and her colleagues did, looking at, and this is the Deschutes River in Washington, not the Deschutes River in Oregon. So this is a coastal, kind of interior coastal basin in Washington state, and saw this very direct correlation between area harvested in the dark columns in there, the road work that was done in those lighter tops of the columns, and then the amount of turbidity that they were seeing in the streams that again was kind of controlled for stream flow. So it would be milligrams of sediment per liter, or would be a typical measure for it. So again, what we have seen in a number of studies that have been done, both this Ryder study in 2009, as well as some work that was actually done down in the Coos Bay Reedsport region, where one of my colleagues, Jeff Hatton, and his graduate students looked at sediment cores in Loon Lake and looked at changes in sediment accumulation rates. And they saw what they thought was an inflection point in the sediment rates that changed after the passage of the Forest Practice Act, or some time after the passage of the Forest Practice Act for it. So we think that we're seeing, both out in the field as well as in the literature, some reductions in sediment yields, typically again as a result of improved practices, and a lot of those practices are driven by increased rules for it, and that's reducing the sediment by potentially half to 90% or so. We're still seeing it, and I'll talk in a minute about I think where we're seeing that with it, but overall terms, it's reduced, at least in historic terms, from what we had seen in the past. And one of the things that is difficult to grapple with is that over this kind of history of logging and the effects of logging, we have areas in the stream that have that kind of legacy sediment that are built up in them. And as you harvest, if you're changing and getting increased flows as a result of harvest, then you may remobilize some of that sediment, and it's moving downstream, and you can actually see it, off on the near shore of the coast where some of these rivers are coming out with it. So one of the big changes that we saw with the Forest Practice Act in 1971, at least, was this requirement for buffers along forest, and we're getting some significantly greater buffers now with the private forest accords that are going to come online in the next couple of years with it. This was an interesting study, this chart on the right here, an interesting study that was again done kind of west of Corvallis in the Coast Range there, where a graduate student actually went out on harvest sites and measured sediment that was coming off of the unit itself, right at the edge of the unit and the riparian area, riparian buffer, and then within the buffer itself. And she did this by essentially putting silt fences out there to capture it with it. And so what she found, and the y-axis here is logarithmic. So each one of these major lines across here is an order of magnitude. So 10 to 100 to 1,000 at the top. And so what she found is that the forested area, was yielding, as a result of these harvests, was yielding about 19 grams or so per square meter of soil that was coming off of it. That soil, a lot of that soil was getting caught up right at the harvest unit boundary and the buffer there, where she was finding 22 grams per square meter of sediment. And then within the buffer area itself, the buffer, there was only about 8 grams or so. So this is this was one of the few studies that really looked at the effectiveness of riparian buffers at preventing or mitigating sediment that was coming off of a harvest unit from actually getting into a stream with that. So that's actually, these buffer areas are effective bigger buffer areas are probably going to be more effective at reducing the sediment. But again, that's all dependent on kind of the underlying lithography, the soil, the slope, the roughness, rainfall patterns, things like that. The other piece that is important, and again, we've got some fairly good information on that, is that particularly on steep slopes, shallow soils, once you harvest, you've got a lot of that root strength that was holding things into place there. Rapidly growing roots, oftentimes intertwined with other trees and things like that. What happens when you cut those slopes is that over time, and again, this is kind of a 5 to 7 year process, those stumps and the roots start to deteriorate. And when they deteriorate, what you've got is these kind of flow paths in the soil themselves that are taking the water that's still coming down, and they're flowing into the soil, and the water is building up in the soil because it's got those voids in there to fill up. And then once that amount of water and the weight of that water overcomes basically the friction and the cohesion in the soil, that's when you start getting things sliding. And so there is fairly good evidence that in certain circumstances with steep slopes and shallow soils, that when you harvest, you start seeing more landslides 5 to 7 years after a harvest for it. And again, that's very dependent on the topography of the area. You've got very steep head walls that are far more sensitive to this than some of the more gentler terrain where it's much less likely to be a problem. But that is one effect of harvest that causes landslides and can cause sediment going into streams. Now, some of that sediment is kind of good sediment, particularly if it brings wood with it, because that's what's a habitat forming process in stream channels. So not always all bad with it. And then classically, the roads were and still are probably the most significant source of sediment that is a result of active forest management with it. And like I said, there's a lot of legacy roads out there that were very poorly designed. There's a lot of abandoned roads out there. One of the features of the private forest accords is that ODF is now tasked with identifying all of these abandoned roads and coming up with a plan to mitigate their potential effects for it. And as I said, I spent 15 years with the Coos Watershed Association, and we did a lot of road work with it, replacing culverts and upgrading or what's called storm-proofing roads for it. And typically what we saw was there were kind of two different facets of sediment that was coming off of roads. There was what we call the catastrophic sediment that resulted typically during large storms when culverts would get plugged or there was too much water for the capacity of culverts, and then you would blow out the road fill with it. And so you would get just a huge slug of sediment going down a steep slope or going down a stream channel with it. So that was the catastrophic sediment. The other facet of roads and sediment is what we call the chronic sedimentation. And what that involves is basically the breakdown of the road surface material, gravel. If it's a gravel road, hopefully they're not hauling on raw unsurfaced roads for it. You're also getting the cut banks or raveling off, and that material's coming down into ditches. And if those ditches, typically an inboard ditch, if those ditches are what are called hydrologically connected to the streams, then that sediment and that's coming off the road surface and off of the cut banks is going into a stream. Luckily, we know that there are best management practices in terms of placement of cross drains to hydrologically disconnect those road surfaces from streams, and where that has been done on roads, and I was involved in a lot of that down here in the Coos Bay region. You could have heavy hauling, heavy use roads, and if the road surface was disconnected from the stream, you wouldn't see any effect of it in the stream itself. So actually, we have good knowledge about the best management practices to disconnect these roads from streams. It's just a matter that it needs to be put into place for it. Okay, so everybody's favorite topic, herbicides with it. This is a chapter that I ended up picking up with it. And so I spent a couple of years spending some really quality time looking into both the amount of herbicides that were, operations that were being conducted on Oregon forest. I looked at all of the studies that had been done on herbicide use, and that's actually only about of the peer-reviewed studies that have been done specific to the Pacific Northwest on herbicide use is a handful for it. Looked at a lot of agency reports, looked through every complaint that the state had gotten on a forest operation for it over the last 20 years or so. And so what do we see? So first of all, there are, through the FERM's notification process, determined that there are about 7,000 or so applications of operations with herbicide spraying in Oregon annually for that. And that covers about 1 million acres a year or so. It's a little difficult actually using the FERM system because you can notify for an operation and you don't really ever know if that operation actually occurred or not, and how much was used and what was used is never reported. So there's some data difficulties there. We also looked at fertilizer because there's some concern over the potential effects of adding nitrogen or phosphorus into streams, and you get eutrophication, and you may get some problems with harmful algal blooms if you've got too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. But those are actually fairly limited number of fertilizer applications or so, and those are only covering about 125,000 acres a year or so for it. The concerns that are fairly well known is you've got drift that's coming in, particularly when you have aerial application of herbicides. You have potential concerns if you've got some overland flow that's in the water that's coming in off of an area that's been sprayed and getting into a stream. And then you may also have movement of this herbicide through the soil itself, and that's particularly a concern if it's attached to sediment, which some of the herbicides will strongly attach to sediments, others won't for it. So one of the things, and again, based on a very limited number of studies, is that all of these studies showed that after herbicide application, you got some signal in the stream itself. So, and I think that's incontrovertible, really. I don't think there's much argument about that. The question is the concentrations of the chemical that end up in the stream are typically very small for it. We have very sophisticated detection methods now that can detect chemicals down to the billionth of a part per million for it. So our ability to detect it is really high. If you start looking at the benchmarks that are used to determine whether those concentrations are significant, have significant effects or not, typically what we're seeing in streams after an application is fairly insignificant. So you've got a number of different kind of thresholds for it. There's an aquatic life threshold that US EPA and USGS have established. And then you've got a human health concern, and actually the human health concern effects are about an order of magnitude above the aquatic life effects for it. And what we're seeing in streams is still typically an order of magnitude or two below the aquatic life effects for it. So these concentrations are extremely low. They do dissipate fairly rapidly going downstream for it. Some of that's just the classic solution to pollution is dilution. But these chemicals are also breaking down as they're going downstream. They're breaking down in sunlight, and most of them are water soluble, so they're breaking down that way. And most of the chemicals used in forestry are not ones that bioaccumulate. So forestry is the uses in forestry are substantially different than the way chemicals are oftentimes used in agriculture. The chemicals are different, the application methods are different, and significantly the application frequency is different in forestry compared to other uses. So if you look at this kind of cycle of a rotation in this chart here, and you see on the left side in that star, you've got the harvest there. So people may go in, forest managers may go in a couple of years prior to a harvest. If they know that there's going to be some problem vegetation that's going to be released when they harvest the conifers in there, they may go in and manually do what's called hack and squirt and kill that stuff beforehand before it gets released and becomes much more difficult to control. Once they do the harvest, then they may be 1 to 2 applications of herbicides, probably more often 1 if they can control it. For site preparation, they plant it, they may do a second one to again control mostly the deciduous vegetation in the brush, because they want to favor the planted conifers for it. Then they may do at, depending on the site and depending on the owner and how intensively they're managing it, they may do a pre-commercial thin at 7 to 15 years in there just to reduce the growing stock so they get it to where they want it, where it will grow fast. They may, after that thin, do a fertilization, although again, that's in a fairly limited extent for land, and or they may do a commercial thin at 20 to 30 years, and again may or may not do a fertilization after that, and then at that point, then nothing is really done for, in terms of chemical treatments for a stand until it comes up to the next rotation age for it. So there are a fair number of chemicals that are used in there, and these are the chemicals that are typically used in forestry, and we are seeing those chemicals in surface water samples that DEQ collects. There's no reasonable way to be able to trace if those chemicals are coming off of forests or coming off of other land uses, and looked at a lot of the data. EWEB, the Eugene and Water Electric Board, and USGS have some very good studies on the McKenzie River. They were in some cases turning up kind of hot spots in chemicals And in one case, it actually ended up as in a forested watershed, but that had a house right down on the road near where they were sampling. It ended up actually being somebody's heart medicine that triggered it. So it's hard to, and again, there are not sufficient studies to really show what happens to these chemicals once they are especially at a watershed level, what happens once they're sprayed and where they end up going. And it's difficult again to really understand what the magnitude of that effect is on community water supplies, because they're not testing for it, or they're not testing for it at the right time. Because when you see these kind of flushes of runoff from these forested areas that have been treated, it's typically the first or second rainstorm after the application that is the bulk of whatever is coming off of the application, and that's not typically consistent with the sampling schedule that the water utilities are using. So there's that disconnect with it. It was clear, fairly clear, at least to me, that looking at the studies, that and there was some good work done on the effects of buffers on preventing spray drift for it. And it was, and there was a kind of classic study actually up in your area for it, where you can, the applicators are required or prohibited from spraying live water over live water. And so I was looking at the helicopter path, because they do GPS paths on all of this, so you can look at the spray bands that they're doing, and they were buffering really nicely, around the streams for it, but they weren't buffering a lot of these, really smaller tributary stuff. And it was, and so the fish streams, had the riparian buffers that were required under the Forest Practice Act. The non-fish streams didn't. And so it was pretty clear that actually you were getting some spray drift that was going into these streams that did not have forested buffers required for them. And that's going to, again, also change fairly significantly with the private forest accord on there for it. And so it's actually interesting that if one of the studies that we looked at in terms of riparian buffers and application is that you can have, it's kind of the Goldilocks situation, where you need to have some trees, but if you have a too dense stand of trees, what happens is that the wind comes up and goes over the trees, and then it drops down in it. So you need to have the wind actually flowing through the riparian buffer to have that filtering effect of it, to keep it out of the streams for it. And again, there's a lot that we don't know about how herbicides are working. And part of it is that most of the studies have been done just on the active ingredient for the herbicides. But we're also having this whole other types of chemicals called adjuvants that are added to the herbicide mixes. One of them is to actually have larger droplets so that you don't get that spray. So you've got drift inhibitors that are added in there. You've got anti-foaming agents so that you can have a good application rate for it. So there's lots of things that are besides just the active herbicides that are being sprayed in units. And then typically, or not typically, but oftentimes you may have a multiple, 2 or 3 different herbicides that are in what are called tank mixes, that get applied. And so we don't really know a lot about what the effects of those combinations are. That work just hasn't been done. And as I said, we don't do a very good job of rigorously monitoring these areas, even though the state has something called the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership, which I think is somewhat of a misnomer, but that's another matter. With it, that is supposed to be evaluating kind of at a watershed level the effects of herbicide and pesticide use with it. But there's no modeling that has been done that looks at a watershed level and looks at the effects of spray and kind of, what are the cumulative effects of it. What are the cycles of it? How is it related to rainfall and things like that? So there's a entire lack of modeling in there. I think to the detriment of the people who need to have herbicides as a tool. I would make that case. So. Okay, so finally, quickly, this natural organic matter and disinfectant byproducts. So what happens in there is that you have a requirement for some level of residual chlorine to be in the water all the way to your tap. And you can typically you can taste that if you're on a city water, if you're on a community water supply that's regulated for it. And then what happens is that these disinfectant byproducts, which can be carcinogenic and toxic, are created when that organic carbon in the water is in contact with chlorine for a lingering amount of time with it. And so this is something that the disinfectant byproducts is something that the utilities actually test for on a regular basis. And where they're doing the test is they're going to the kind of far end of their piping system with it. And they're taking their water samples from there, which is appropriate. But that typically is water that has stood for a long period of time. And so they, are periodically, most utilities, periodically are finding these disinfectant byproducts, and they may try and adjust their carbon in the water or adjust their chlorine as a result of that. But they still have this requirement to have a residual amount of chlorine in the water. Actually, it's fairly easy from a consumer's perspective to reduce that risk. And it's a pretty small risk to begin with by just simply running the water for a while. Particularly if you've been, out of the house or you've got a cabin or someplace, that hasn't been used for a while and that water's been sitting there, just run it for a while and you'll clean all of that out for it. So that's kind of the substance of what we have found through this. There is a real need for more studies. I mean, I know as an academic that's typically, everybody says that, but if we really care about this, we do need to put the money in to do the studies for it. We have still have some problems with sediment turbidity, particularly in steep landslide prone areas. The private forest accord is really changed that whole procedure now for it. So as we see both the mapping that we were talking about earlier that Terrain Works is doing statewide to identify landslide prone areas, and then as a rulemaking that ODF is going to do as a result of the private forest accord comes out, I keep an eye on that, because I think that's going to change land management so that there's greater protection for these landslide prone areas. And then finally, I think in terms of the forest chemicals, if we don't start getting better studies and better monitoring and modeling, I think that what's called the social license to use herbicides in forest management is going to continue to be challenged with it. And there again was some fairly substantial changes made even prior to this latest set of legislation as a result of the initial private forest accord. work that changed the notification process and increased the buffers for spray with it. And so again, I think it's incumbent on everybody, but particularly the folks that want to continue to use herbicides, to make sure that there's a good investment in demonstrating that they are safe as well as effective for it. So again, appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Zach, don't know if you've got some questions, but I'm happy to answer questions pretty much as long as anybody wants to ask them. So, and here you get, again, if you want more information, go to the OSU Extension website. You can download the chapters of the book. Interestingly, you can't download the whole book at one time, but you can download chapter after chapter after chapter of it. And also, I'm available at least through June 30th to talk about this. So, all right, Zach.
Quick, huh? So I got a question in the chat here, and I want everyone to know that if you have questions, please send them to me, and I'll read them on out, and so we can get everybody's questions answered. So the first question we have here is, did your group look at reports on fire retardant chemical drift after fires and how that might impact water supply systems?
No. So, and we did have some discussion of that, and basically we bit off more actually than we could really digest with the 4 areas that we looked at. I think it's a reasonable concern on it, but that was not something that we evaluated. We did evaluate the fire risk though for community watersheds, and I took that slide out because actually we weren't able to model fire risk on the North Coast very well because there was an insufficient, I mean, I know there was a Tillamook burn, there was a Lincoln County burn last year, but there just wasn't sufficient data to model in the process that the Forest Service was using to model fire risk, for the North Coast. So.
Well, oh wait, here we go. Did you look at the frequency of herbicide applications in relation to location and ecosystem type, i.e. coastal Oregon versus Willamette Valley?
Yes, kind of. I guess I would say that there is significant herbicide use on the coast for it. I think that's a combination of the fact that we have a healthy growth of brush, of competing vegetation on the coast in areas. Once you cut the trees down, lots of other things come up for it. Although there are forest managers that are successfully revegetating areas on the coast without using chemicals for it. So I guess probably the most accurate answer is that I did look at some of those patterns. We didn't really report on those patterns for it. And it was somewhat difficult in the data set that we had. We could have done it on a county basis, but a lot of the counties run from the Willamette Valley out to the coast. So we didn't have, there wasn't access or there wasn't sufficient capacity on our part to basically look at individual notifications of chemical action in a spatially referenced for it. I guess it's the best answer for that.
That's fair. Do you know wait a minute. Do you know that the private forest accord will fully be incorporated into legislation? How soon would new rules start once legislation is passed?
Okay, well, you had your ODF guy there earlier. Okay, so all right, well, the legislation is passed. So that was passed in this session of the legislature. So it's about a month old now for it. The ODF is required for the bulk of the regulations to have them completed by November 30th of this year, which I think is entirely unrealistic for it. And I'm not sure what happens if they fail to get them done there. But then there are other things that are kind of rolled out over the next 2 or 3 years for it. So the private forest accord and that legislation is the most significant change to the Forest Practice Act since it was first put in place 50 years ago. So, and the substance of it is substantial for it, as well as the trade-off between the certainty that the forest owners, landowners, and managers have, that hopefully is going to come along through the Habitat Conservation Plan. And the Habitat Conservation Plan is supposed to be completed by 2027. So we're still, 5 years out on that. And that's a federal process. It needs an EIS probably. So there's a lot of steps to get to that.
It's pretty exciting though.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next question we have here is, in your opinion, what is the biggest threat to drinking water? Is it herbicides, harvest, roads, something else?
I think it depends on where you are. So coastal watersheds, I think and so for the community water supplies on the coast, these are typically very small contributing watersheds on there, like the Oceanside one that's 2 square miles. The Coos Bay North Bend Water Board, which is supplying probably 25,000 to 30,000 people, is less than 10 square miles probably for it, although there's some well backup for it. So I think actually long-term, the biggest threat on the coastal watersheds is quantity, overall quantity for it, with a population that has that tends to double or triple in the summer, which is when you've got the least water available for it. So I think for coastal areas in particular, I think the biggest threat is quantity for it. And I think there's going to need to be some fairly significant investments in infrastructure to intertie between these small community water supplies. So if you've got a problem in one small watershed, you don't have to shut everybody off. You can shift things around for that.
Create some resilience. Yeah. I have a question here. In very rough terms, are cities and municipalities bigger or smaller risks to downstream drinking water supplies than forest industry?
Yes.
Okay.
So what we know, and I think it may depend, but what we know is that the agricultural use of chemicals is orders of magnitude higher than forestry. So we don't know a lot about herbicide and pesticide use in Oregon because the legislature has prohibited collecting that data, basically. But there was a period of time, there was a short window when that was actually collected for it. And what came from that, and that was I think the early 2000s, what came from that is that forestry was about 3% of the chemical use in Oregon for it. And so, and forests are a lot more than 3% of the land cover in there. And so you've got agriculture, but I think you also have an entirely or almost entirely unregulated use of herbicides and pesticides by homeowners with it. You can walk into your Home Depot or Ace Hardware and walk out with gallons of Roundup, and you don't have to be licensed, have any training for it. Nobody's keeping track of it, of what you're using or when you're using it or where you're using it. And from the studies that I'm aware of, homeowners typically over apply chemicals, because if a little bit's good, more must be better for control of things. And so you've just got, I would be much more concerned, and actually I live in a kind of rural residential area. I'm much more concerned about what my neighbors are doing than what my forest managers are doing with it, because they're licensed, they're trained with it. Looking at all of the pesticide complaints that have came into the state, by and large, there were some bad actors out there in the forest kind of application, helicopter application stuff, but those were more readily dealt with it. Not entirely, most of them then went to Idaho, but I have more confidence that the applications are being done in a better manner, I guess, on forest applications than I would for my neighbor.
Yeah. Our next question here is, Clatsop County industrial forest lands seem to have a 30 to 35 year rotation. ODF manages for longer rotations. You said 35 to 50. How did you get rotation numbers?
Oh, just made that up. Basically you have different managers, and it depends on where you are. It depends on the site quality of the forest land that you've got. It depends on your management objectives for it. So all of those will alter and affect your kind of average rotation age for it. We know that the kind of financial folks are driving a shorter rotation age for the industrial timber and the real estate investment trusts that are increasingly owning this land for it. The small woodland owners typically have a different set of incentives, and in general have a longer rotation age than industrial forester does. And then the state probably has potentially an even longer has a longer rotation age, and then the feds have an even longer one for it. So 30 to my 35 to 55 years was just kind of saying that in terms of the cycle of herbicide application, you're getting maybe 3 applications of herbicides at the most over the course of a 35 to 55 year rotation, in comparison to, for instance, an agricultural operation that may be, or Christmas trees. If you want to hear a horror story, look at the Christmas tree industry for it. But where you have applications of every year or so, or maybe multiple applications every year, if it's an orchard or pesticides and with pesticides and things like that. So the 35 to 55 years was just to provide a context for thinking about how much chemicals and how frequently chemicals are applied.
Pretty good. In the chat, we had a forester mention that in Clatsop County, the standard is 40 years specifically. So thank you for that clarification too. So my board chair has a question for you. He wants to.
Well, you better let him ask it then.
Yeah, I know. That's what I figured, right?
Hi, Jon, and thanks for your presentation and for allowing us to ask some questions. So you'd mentioned in your presentation a couple of things that, and I'm going to talk, or my question is going to be about pesticide application. So you mentioned that the FERM's notifications don't tell you don't tell us, the public, what potential is included in any of the pesticide applications, and also that your report or your study found that the concentrations were that were found in water were relatively low relative to, I'm guessing, EPA drinking water standards. So my question kind of combines that and says, okay, well, if researchers weren't sure actually what pests or what was being sprayed, how can we be sure that those results were actually relevant to that everything was able to actually be tested for? You know, because it's not cheap to do that, and it is hard to do that. So I'm curious, like how do those both results kind of align or not align?
Okay, so you would really appreciate chapter 6 of the Teresa Tapp report on it, which goes into depth on that. So
I will look it up.
So partly, Mark, some of the FERM's notification rules have changed since we did that study, and they changed as a result of the initial what was called Senate Bill 1506 in the previous legislative sessions that set the whole private forest accord process up, but made some immediate changes in notifications for it. So I believe now today that you can find out, and probably one of the foresters could answer that question better, but I believe now that you can, that they have to tell ODF now what actually is being sprayed or applied now. What has historically, and what was happening when we were putting this together, is that you could notify in your notification, your spray notification, you could have a whole host of chemicals, and that gave the forest manager a lot of flexibility because you don't ever really know what the weather's going to be like, and maybe even what the weeds are out there or the brush out there that you want to control. You know, so somebody could file a notification and it could have multiple chemicals in there. It could cover multiple units with it, and there was no reporting after the fact of what had been actually applied. And I don't think even the current rules require reporting. I do think they require reporting what you've applied, but I don't know that they require reporting how much you've applied to it. So that's the FERM's piece of it with it. The other part that you talked about, the studies, and that I was referring to, is that these studies actually did know what was applied, and they were fairly small studies, meaning that there was maybe 3 units or 3 different operations, or typically that were studied, and so they knew what was being applied for and how much was being applied in there. And then they typically even had the helicopter GPS record so that you could actually see how it was being applied for, where were they, what areas were they buffering and what areas weren't they buffering in it. So in those studies, and again, there's really only 2 or 3 of them that were of that nature that have been done in Oregon for it. So there was a good, there was good information for those, but the operators also knew they were being studied for it as they were applying it. So I think what my sense from those studies was what you were getting was the best practices. So this is what happens under the best of circumstances. And we know that anybody who's ever been out trying to manage land, things go south on you, at times. And so you're not always operating according to the best that you can do for it. I mentioned the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership, which is an ODF, DEQ, Oregon Department of Agriculture. There's probably other agencies involved in that. And they will go into an area, and there's about 6 or 7 of these statewide for it. And it's an effort to try and work with the people who are applying chemicals and the agencies who are regulating it and supporting those uses to try and get better practices in terms of herbicide use. And they will do studies in there. So they will sample as a part of the pesticide stewardship partnerships, but they're not they don't know how much has actually been applied for that. I mean, you can know what the notifications are, so you can kind of get an idea. And now with Google Earth, you can usually look and see when harvests have been done, at least down to a year for it. But you don't really know how much was they in those studies, they didn't really ever know how much was being applied. And then typically their sampling was done on a grab sampling basis rather than a continual sampling basis. And so they were going out taking grab samples, but they weren't taking grab samples at the times when you're most likely to get the runoff for it, which are the first storms in a season for it. And so, my summarization of that in chapter 6, is that that's a great outreach effort, but that is not good research. And again, there was no modeling for it.
Thanks. Yeah, it seems like in my brief investigations of this kind of stuff, there are plenty of data gaps. So trying to piece everything together can be a challenge. I had one other question, sorry if you don't mind, and that was back when we were looking at the 2 different creeks in the Alci watershed. I was kind of in and out during the start of your presentation because I was taking care of my 3-month-old, but I was curious if there was any, how close those creeks were, and if there could have needed some sort of accounting for maybe difference in rainfall amounts. I mean, we're looking at a watershed, so it's potential there could be some rain shadow effect, or maybe some more volume of water found in this one creek than the other in the subbasin, but not sure if that was part of that study also.
Yeah, so the basins were tributaries to the Salmon Creek, which is a tributary to the Alci River. In there, they are fairly closely associated with each other, in terms of they're not very far apart from each other. And one of the things that there was a calibration period before the harvest for it. So I talked about the before after control impact part. So the before part for it is that there was a 6-year in both the original study and this subsequent, what was called Alci Revisited, there was a 6-year calibration period, before anything was before you had the impact or the harvest for it. And so during that calibration period, what you were looking at was, what is the relationship between what's happening in Needle Branch versus Flynn Creek, and those were the 2 that were used in both studies for it. And so you're looking at how, they're not exactly the same. You can't have that level of replication in nature for it. But what you want to know is kind of, how do they work in relationship to each other? And if you've got a good data set, and 6 years is actually fairly long. Most of these studies, if you can do a year of baseline, you consider yourself in good shape. But so you've got 6 years before looking at and understanding the relationship between how those 2 watersheds act. Then you've got the impact on one, and then you've got 6 years after that to look at the change in response for that. So that's kind of how they deal with the fact that they're not the same size. There may be some differences there are, small differences in watershed size. There may be some differences in precipitation regimes, although they were pretty close to each other.
Thanks, Jon. I look forward to reading that chapter 6, and I'll email you if you have any questions.
Okay, great. Fran, Rick, do you have any questions?
So we got a couple more in the chat here. And the next one is, were there any findings that surprised you or were counterintuitive to expectations?
Oh, that's really good. That's a great question. Well, I think that I was, I will admit, a little bit skeptical about this summer base flow deficit thing going into it. You know, there were a couple of studies. There was one that Julia Jones led, who's also at OSU, led at the H.J. Andrews research station. You know, and a lot of people picked that up, particularly in the environmental community, picked that up and, you know, started raising that as an issue. And I was somewhat skeptical of it. And then we went through and Catalina Segura and as well, and Julia was involved in that. And we looked at the Alci stuff, and it turned out to be operating the same thing, the same way. So as a result of that, I think I became much more convinced that that has some, you know, potential effects, and the magnitude of those effects are really going to depend on the watershed itself and the harvest patterns in the watershed itself. And so I've watched and I've worked with industrial forestry companies now for 20 years or so, and one of the approaches, and it makes sense for a lot of reasons, is to go in and completely cut a basin in there. And that makes sense if you're concerned about roads. It makes a lot of sense because you are, you know, your road impact is actually more concentrated that way, and you can invest in upgrading the roads versus if you had to disperse it, you know, over a much larger area for it. So I think in terms of the impacts of that on a community water supply, it's really going to depend on how much of that basin above you has been harvested, and what the pattern of harvest and regrowth in it is. And so, you know, in a lot of places, you know, again, these small watersheds on the coast that are already challenged in terms of quantity during summer base flows, I do think that that's something to be concerned about.
Our next question is a longer one. When a fertilizer plan was proposed for industrial lands with many people getting their water off those lands, there was talk that grouse will eat the pellets. I was getting ready to test the surface water off these lands when the project was not implemented. Do you think quail and grouse eat the fertilizer pellets?
I have no idea. I have no idea. If there were minerals in them, I could imagine that they would go for them. Yeah, I don't know. I have not, that has not ever come up in my my world yet, but it's, you know, would those pellets be eaten? Yeah, I don't know. There are some people, you know, who do that kind of work that could potentially be asked for it.
Yeah. And that's the end of the questions that I have here tonight. So, oh, wait. I have a, hi, Jon, so nice seeing you. The water quality issue is becoming more and more important, as you say, with climate change and longer periods of drier summers and fall.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not going away. I think we made a good start with the trees to tap report. I think there's there's really, good work in there for it. I think it actually kind of is going to set a good baseline that we can use in the future to look at what the changes were as a result of the private forest accords. So in many ways, what the Trees to Tap report is doing is looking at the situation and the effects of active forest management with forest regulations in the 20s, the first 2 decades of the 2000s, and 20 years from now, there's probably going to be an interesting a subsequent study to the one that we did from the initial 20-year-old one that will look at then what's the research showing in the differences as a result of the private forest accord. And because the private forest accord and the HCP are anticipated to have a 50-year span, that's going to give us time. Not me, you or Mark, your 3-month-old son.
Couple more ones have come up. So first of all, I think that the person who wrote that last comment wants you to know that they are Fran.
Okay, Fran, good, Fran.
And then another question came up. There's been a lot of local discussion on the North Coast of making efforts to protect our water supplies by purchasing the watersheds. Is this, in your opinion, a worthwhile effort?
Yes. So, yeah, and I'll use the Coos Bay North Bend, as an example there. So our water, well, I'm not on city water here, so I'm on a well like many other folks are. But the cities of Coos Bay, North Bend, in that area, service area, including Charleston, the city and the water board owns their watershed for it. And so they manage, and that's forested, most of it's forested. So they can manage that with water quality in mind. Although the city of Coos Bay also likes the money that periodically comes from timber harvest. So for instance, they don't use any herbicides in the municipal watersheds there for it. And so when you, and I think Astoria is in a relatively similar situation as well. So if you own your watershed, you control it with it. So I think that's never a bad idea for it, but it depends on the size of your watershed, how expensive that's going to get for it. I think also, and we saw that both in our surveys and particularly in the conference discussions for it. I think if you've got good communication between the community water supply, the water utility, and your land managers in the watershed, I think you can get a long ways just through good communication and developing working relationships with them, kind of like watershed councils do. So you may not need to own it, but if you own it, you have control of it.
Another question here about the forest accords. Are longer rotations part of the forest accord? And are carbon markets part of it?
No, as far as I'm aware, to both of those for it. So what is in the private forest accord principally is an increase in buffer widths and extension of riparian buffers to non-fish streams for it, a prohibition, in most cases, a prohibition of harvest within the buffers for it. So there's some substantial changes to how the riparian management areas are the extent of them and what are allowable activities in them. There's also a significant piece on high landslide hazard areas for it. There's a huge piece on roads. And Zach, you guys ought to be in the lead on the road stuff because the private above 5,000 acre. So the, industrial forest landowners have to survey their roads, and they have to do it in 5 years, and they have to prioritize their response, and they have to get all their culverts up to bigger standards than what we have now in 20 years for it. So there's going to be a huge demand for road work. And there's also, as you were discussing right at the end of your business meeting, there's some other provisions for small forest owners. And those are going to also, small forest owners aren't going to have to upgrade their roads until they harvest with it. And then there's some of this $10 million a year for assistance for replacing culverts. So there's also some substantial changes in roads, but I don't ever foresee the state trying to set rotation ages on private forest land for it. I don't think that's gonna, well, the private forest accord basically sets the stage for the next 50 years. So it can be modified, but it's a very difficult process to modify it. So basically what was agreed upon in the private forest accords now, it's intended to be in place for 50 years, for the next 50 years.
All right, I think Mark has another question for you, so I'm going to let him pop back on again.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks, Jon. Sorry for one question I forgot to ask earlier, back about herbicides, and I think I misspoke. I think I said pesticides earlier, but most of them are probably going to be herbicides. But I'm curious if you are aware of any studies at Oregon State or maybe more regionally about potential, I guess, synergistic or effects of multiple exposures to various herbicides or some of the solvents or additives or adjuvants that are applied during aerial spraying?
I'm not aware of any in the forestry realm for it. There may be other stuff that's being done, in the ag realm for it, and then effects on what, because human effects have a kind of whole different set of people that get involved with those studies for it. But I think I think I was clear, hope I was clear, that there's really insufficient studies for herbicide use in forest land for it. So we don't know. I don't think we know as what we need to know to be able to effectively manage.
Yeah, thanks. That seemed to be kind of the conclusion in some of the just cursory research that I've done, that it was just a data gap, that we don't know if there could be a significant effect for human health or aquatic health as well. So yeah, I was just curious if you might be more on the pulse.
Yeah, I'm less, I guess, less concerned about it, frankly. I know there are some people who have a hyper concerned about herbicide use on forest lands. But in terms of herbicide and particularly pesticides, and pesticides is the kind of overarching umbrella for all of these things. And then there's insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, under the pesticide realm. But I think that there's much greater risk to human health for pesticide uses outside of forestry applications than there are in forestry applications.
I'll give it a couple seconds here for any other questions to come in, but I think that might be about it.
All right. Well, thanks, Zach, for this opportunity, and maybe sometime we can even meet in person.
Shoot, right? That sounds pretty good. Maybe I'll have to make a trip down to Coos there sometime.
Yeah, or I can come up with it, but yeah, certainly if you're down to Coos, come down and we'll go out and look at some cool stuff.
Hey, that sounds great to me. I'd love to, and or come up here and visit. You know, you're always welcome.
Okay,
All
great.
right, well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and everybody stay tuned. Our next talk is going to be about the impacts of warmer oceans on nearshore fisheries. So it should be a pretty neat talk as well. So again, thank you, Jon. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us today. And have a great evening.
Okay, take
Thanks, Zach.
care.
Thanks, Jon.
Bye.